Good afternoon. Welcome to our Positive Links speaker series session entitled Ethical Learning and Character Development, presented by the Center for Positive Organizations here at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. My name is Gretchen Spreitzer, and I am a core faculty member of the Center for Positive Organizations, as well as the Associate Dean for Engaged Learning and Professional Development. Before we get started today, I'd like to share with you a few notes on the technology that we're using today. So for today's event, you'll see that attendees are view-only participants and cannot be seen or heard. We've also turned off the chat and hand raise features, but questions can be asked throughout the event using the Q&A feature. And those questions will be visible to everyone, with the purpose of, we're going to invite you to upvote the questions that most resonate with you, because we hope to have a few minutes at the end of Maryam's talk for her to answer some of your upvoted questions today. We've also enabled live transcription services for our events. This feature can be turned on or off using the Zoom settings at the bottom of your screen. And lastly, we are recording this event and we'll post the video on CPO's website as soon as we can. And that way you can view it again or share it with somebody else you think would be interested. The Center for Positive Organizations would like to thank the Sanger Leadership Center, the Tauber Institute of Global Operations, the Samuel Zell and Robert H. Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, and Diane and Paul Jones for their sponsorship support of our Positive Links speaker series this year. We'd also like to thank our series promotional partners, Ann Arbor Spark and the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management. All right, well, with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today. Maryam Kouchaki is a professor of management and organizations at the Kellogg School of Management. Hello, Maryam. So good to see your smiling face. Maryam is originally from Iran, where she has an undergraduate degree in physics. But as part of her MBA coursework, she was introduced to the field of organizational behavior in an elective, and she was hooked. Shortly thereafter, she came to the United States and she received her PhD in organizational behavior from beautiful University of Utah. And she also completed her postdoc at Harvard University's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. So she has amazing credentials. She studies the psychological experience of everyday moral encounters and decision-making. I know Maryam in her capacity as editor-in-chief of one of our top journals, where I'm on the editorial board. It's named Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, and it's a lot of work. Somebody doesn't get into that position unless they're very well known and respected. And her work is so respected in the halls of academia. She was selected as one of the best 40 professors under the age of 40 in 2020 by Poets and Quants. And she also has high visibility in the popular press. Her work matters and has been covered in outlets such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Business Week, and the BBC. On a personal note, I like Maryam, or Maryam like me, we both like running and traveling. She's also a mom to an 11-month-old girl. And she lives in beautiful Evanston, Illinois, where she told me she's able to walk along Lake Michigan on her way to work each day. I'm sure that can be a little cold at this time of year, Maryam. So I am very excited to learn from you today, as well as I know our audience is too. So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Maryam Kouchaki. Thank you, Maryam.
Thank you, Gretchen, for the amazing introduction. You're very kind. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited and honored to be here to share some of my work with you. In this talk, I want to propose that in contrast to the view that businesses corrupt and bring out the worst in people, indeed, people's experiences at work can also lead to ethical learning and growth. That is, individuals' experiences at work can provide them with opportunities to learn and grow and become better people in all aspects of their life. Today, I will give you a bottom-up approach to ethics, focusing on what individuals can do for themselves to take ownership over their moral development at work and broadly, and a top-down approach focusing on what organizations can do to create a workplace environment conducive to ethical learning to help workers strive to become their best selves. These approaches, both the bottom-up and top-down approaches, highlight the potential role of the workplace as a moral laboratory that allows individuals to engage in an ongoing process of ethical learning to find opportunities and support they need to learn, grow, and further develop their moral character. In my talk in this presentation, I will rely on my own research as well as others from the fields of organizational behavior, social psychology, moral psychology, behavioral ethics. Over the past 3 decades, numerous cases of corporate corruption and misconduct have had a deep impact in society and have led organizational members and public to become more distrusting and cynical of corporate leaders and practices. In the wake of a large number of misconduct scandals we have seen from fall of Enron in 1990s to the more recent scandals at Facebook, Wells Fargo, researchers and practitioners all are trying to understand the reasons for misconduct. One dominant perspective view proposes that most of the misconduct we observe is a matter of a few bad apples. Basically, it's a dispositional argument that bad people are responsible for the scandals we are observing. That's when we can blame a few opportunistic, greedy people and organizations have little influence on their behaviors. For example, Enron would be a good example. We heard a lot of stories about how few bad apples really ruined the culture at Enron. Another perspective is that blame for unethical behavior rests on organizations with ethical culture. That is, organizations are promoting a mindset and practice of do anything necessary to ensure business success. And this mindset, this type of culture is the reason. In fact, many examples that come to our mind is from this perspective. For example, if you think of cases like Wells Fargo, you see that how managers encourage bad behavior through setting up challenging, unrealistic goals for their employees and the pressures that they put on employees. But when we think broadly, we see examples of misconduct that doesn't necessarily fit these two models, these two perspectives nicely. Looking at examples of misconduct, some of them are more serious, some are heavily publicized, so we heard of them, some are more minor, and some started at the very top of the organization, like Enron, and some started at bottom or middle of the organization, for example, Wells Fargo case. And importantly, there are some other examples of everyday behavior, for example, lying to our coworkers, giving in to conflict of interest, or violating health or safety regulations, or cyber loafing. We are all guilty of cyber loafing. And the list could go on and on. So there are many other examples of everyday morally questionable behaviors that we have observed, and we ourselves may be engaging in those behaviors. So let's consider a different explanation. Rather than focusing on bad apples or bad barrels, let's think about individuals' moral self-concept, basically how people see themselves at any point in time, at any moment. With this perspective, we are acknowledging that there are psychological, social, contextual factors that can impact one's ethicality at any moment. Let me explain and give you a few examples. Let's imagine you have a performance task in front of you. In this example, for example, you have like a set of matrices in front of you, and your task is, for each of these metrics, you are asked to find the two numbers that add up to exactly 10, and you will earn 50 cents if you find the correct responses. And I'll ask you to complete this and let us know how many you have completed. Imagine you come to our lab, and I've done many of these set of studies, bringing undergraduates or community members to our lab. And we ask them to complete this performance task. And then we ask the experimenter, my research assistant, to score their responses. Often what we see is that people are able to roughly do 6 of these correctly. So basically they are able to earn on average about $3. Now imagine from the beginning, when you come to the lab, we have put a shredder there, and we tell you that you will complete this task, and you could self-score and then shred your responses. So what we are left out with just the payment slip you give us, and we pay you based on your reported performance. Now, what do you think will happen? Again, I've done many of these studies, and we see, not a surprise, we see an increase. There is basically no difference between the two versions. The matrices are the same, but the only difference is that in one, we have introduced an opportunity to cheat. And here, what we see is that some people take that opportunity and they over-report their performance. Here, in this example I just gave you, we can't really see if few people are cheating or everyone is cheating a little bit, correct? Because we don't really have their actual performance in hand because it's already shredded. Now imagine this time, we ask you to come to the lab, you have your workbook, and then I'll ask you to recycle it, put it in the recycle bin by the door. It's completely anonymous, no name, nothing is on the sheet. And after participants leave, my research assistant actually digs and picks up these performance sheets and then scores them. Now I have the opportunity to see individuals' actual performance and see how many they were able to solve correctly. Here we see if few people cheated and got $10, or most people cheated a little bit, for example, for $2 or $3. Indeed, what our research shows is that when you look at the recycle bin condition and the shredder condition, that people do often the same amount. Basically, everyone is really over-reporting about and earns $2 to $3. Again, this condition, adding this additional condition, shows us that it's not the case that most people are lying a lot, that on average, a lot of people are just over-reporting for few of these matrices. Now, going back to my psychological explanation for dishonesty, let me change individual psychological experience here. So what we do here is that we introduce another condition. In this condition, it's an anxiety recycled condition, what I'm calling it. So participants are asked to listen to a music clip while completing this task. We ask them to listen to the music from the movie Psycho. It's an anxiety-provoking, inducing music. In the recycled condition this time, I'm asking them to just listen to neutral music. It's just a filler music. Basically, what we see now in this condition is that you see people are now significantly more likely to over-report. So when they are listening to the anxiety-inducing music, they over-report their performance even more than this recycled or shredder condition. So you can be skeptical, and again, say that, oh, it's possible that because it's an anxiety-inducing music, people are just making mistakes, correct? It's innocent mistakes they are making. But we've done this study with many different types of tasks and even scenarios where we put people in work-related scenarios, and we find something very similar. For example, in this task, in this study, we asked participants to identify which side of the diagonal, left or right, contains more dots. by clicking either on a bottom labeled more on left or a bottom labeled more on right, as you see on your screen. So the payout is such that we set up the payouts as such that if you press more on the right, you are earning 10 times more than the left. So there is incentives. Here we are introducing self-interest. So there is incentives to say there are more dots on the right. And this task basically is presenting participants with a conflict between giving an accurate answer and maximizing profit. Here in this task, we asked them to do 100 trials. And what's important is that in these trials, about 16 of these trials, we call them right trials. There are actually more dots on the right. There are about 34 of these trials that is ambiguous. And 50 of them that are ambiguous. So it's really hard to know whether there is more right or left. And the 64 that there are left trials where there are actually more dots on the left. And we basically now again assign people to randomly to listen either to the anxiety clip or a neutral clip. And we look at their performances. What we see here is that showing something very similar. Here I'm showing you the mean reported number of right clicks in left trials by condition. This is case of clear cheating. You see that people are more likely in the anxiety condition to report more dots on the left, again, more cheating. And you see same pattern in the ambiguous trials. Around 25 versus 30 trials. But for right trials, where honesty pays off, we see no difference. It's basically very close, 12 versus 13. So there is evidence. Here I'm showing you evidence that is not about making more mistakes when people are anxious, rather than they are very selective when they are over-reporting their performance to earn more money. So here, the question is, what's the explanation? I'm providing you with a psychological argument here that people's self-concept, how they feel at any moment matters when they are making decisions. So our argument here is that, and our data shows that anxiety increases threat perception, which in turn results in self-interested unethical behaviors. In threatening situations, the brain shifts into a state that facilitates the development of rapid defense mechanisms. And in other words, people's cognitive resources are temporarily diverted to restore the self and to facilitate a quick response to the situation. And self-protective impulses basically are unleashed because of the threatening situation. And because of the self-protective impulses, people are more likely to narrowly focus on their own basic needs and self-interest, rather than focusing on being mindful of principles that guide their ethical or moral reasoning. And this leads to more unethical behavior. Now let's look at another example, another psychological factor, this time of day. We ran a similar study with the visual perception task I just described with different set of trials. Here we are interested in effects of time of day. So half of our participants were randomly assigned to do the task in the morning, 8 to 12. The other half did it 2 to 6 p.m. in the afternoon. And we look at the mean reported number of right clicks again in left trials when it's a clear case of cheating. What we see is that cheating more in the afternoon. So this is evidence for people's inability to regulate their behavior and exert self-control in a tempting situation, in this case, in the afternoon to overcome this temptation. In this research, we are showing that even something as simple as the time of day can affect ethical behavior, that the mere experience of everyday living can reduce our ability to self-control. As the day progresses, as we become more tired, our morality is basically, is affected. And it's quite important to know this. So this gradual fatigue during the day because of daily activities, making different decisions, basically expending physical energy, all these activities are having a negative effect on our moral behavior. So our finding suggests that the mere time of day can lead to a systematic failure of good people acting, unethically. And it's very important for us to be aware of this. So far, I have showed you 2 examples, time of day and anxiety, but I have many more examples of research I personally have conducted with my colleagues, as well as other people, showing similar phenomenon. That, for example, if you look at the effect of ambitious, challenging goals, if you look at, if you put people in a business competitive mindset, performance pressures, all of these different examples, these psychological factors lead to the same conclusion. That is, there are psychological social processes that help ordinary people engage in everyday dishonest behavior. Basically, these subtle social and situational forces can swing our moral compass. Importantly, people often don't realize the impact of these factors. If I ask you whether you are more likely to be unethical in the morning or afternoon, most people aren't aware of the systematic effect of time of day on their decisions. So far, my focus has been on one-time bad behavior, but many of the examples of misconduct that we can think of are repeated in nature. So the question is, why do individuals act unethically and even do so repeatedly? Why does everyday dishonesty happens repeatedly? This is a very important question for us as well. Imagine, let me give you an example. Imagine you come to the lab, we ask you to flip a coin to get heads or tail. We actually use an electronic version of this in our lab. So we brought people to the lab and we asked them to first predict an outcome. And if they were right, for example, if you say head and your prediction is head, and when you flip it, you actually get heads, then you will receive $1 as a bonus. In our study, participants did this for 10 rounds. And so they flipped the coin for 10 times. In our study, 52% of these coins, in this particular example, 52% of coin outcomes didn't match participants' predictions. So those rounds presented opportunity for individuals to lie, correct? Because if there is a match, obviously you are lucky. There is a match, you earn the money. But in our study, because it's a fair coin, half of the trials, there was an opportunity for them to lie and earn more money. What we found was that overall, in about 100 rounds, people cheated. 24% of these trials rounds. And looking at single individuals, we found that 45 individuals, which in this case was about 56%, never lied. 35 people, 44% lied at least once. So no surprises. Hopefully, I have already convinced you that people are likely to cheat a bit, correct? This is more evidence for, very similar to the other examples I provided earlier. But our focus here was very different. What we wanted to look for was basically people's memory of their, action. What we did here was that we asked people to come back to the lab 2 weeks later, and then we asked them questions about their memory of the first session. We measured the memory for the details of the first session, the coin toss task. As you see here, reported on the reported memory, in this graph, you see that people had lower memory recall of the task when they cheated than where they were honest. So cheaters on average don't remember details of this situation, the initial task, as well as those who were honest. So, and this is the memory of the details of the lab session. When was it? How did you feel? What was where did you complete it? So it's really details of the task. So we find evidence for forgetting of one's own transgression. It's a case of obfuscation of one's memory. Previous study, like the one I just described, is relying on self-selection, meaning that those who came in, they had a choice to cheat or not. So it wasn't randomly assigned. In a lot of studies we do in lab, what's important is that we need to make sure that we randomly assign people to different conditions. So it's not really individual differences and their self-selection that is dictating the behavior. For example, the study I shared about time of day, people were randomly assigned to do the same exact task either in the morning or afternoon. So we could rule out self-selection because they were randomly assigned into these conditions. Same here. So trust me, I'm not going to get into too much details of this because it's not an academic talk. But trust me on the details. What we did here in this case was that we brought people to the lab. We randomly assigned them to different conditions of a task. In one version, they had a high chance of cheating. Basically, almost everyone cheated a bit. And in the other version, there was no opportunity. So people were honest. And what we measured was their memory in 3 days. And we gave them a second chance to cheat in another performance task. Again, I'm trying to look at and answer the question of why people repeatedly engage in unethical behavior here. What we found was that, similar to the previous study I just shared, people who were in the cheating version, they reported lower memory. There's a difference here on the graph, as you see. And they were also more likely to cheat again, which provided evidence that people who had lower memory, they were more likely to cheat again. So as you see, this is one psychological mechanism that's enabling people to engage in questionable behavior, unethical behavior over time. Here I gave you one example of repeated dishonesty, but there is more work. Again, my own work as well as other people that have shown there are psychological social processes that help ordinary people engage in repeated everyday dishonest behavior. So all this points out, like all the evidence I have shown you so far, all point out to moral fallibility, that we are not perfect and are likely to make mistakes or to fail in being moral. In fact, if research from the past 2 decades or more, including some of my own, has taught us nothing else, it has made it clear that humans are morally fallible. Basically, everyday people who view themselves as good, honest individuals end up violating their own personal moral values, sometimes even unknowingly, and they find numerous ways to rationalize and justify or ignore this behavior. So where do we go from here? I think that's my question. Do we just give up? I think that's important, correct? Because so far it seems to be rather a pessimistic or negative view that almost everyone is likely to engage in questionable behavior, and even so repeatedly. So are we gonna just give up and say that this is something that's gonna happen no matter what? My hope is that the answer is no. For the remainder of the time I have with you, I want to emphasize the role of learning and character development. I want to start with mentioning my amazing colleague, Isaac Smith at BYU, and give him most of credit for some of our writing in this topic. In the last couple of years, the two of us have conducted research together and have written quite extensively, proposing both a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach, looking at issues of ethical learning and character development. The two of us have written 2 Harvard Business Review articles in addition to other papers in which we describe our thinking on ethical learning and character development. Based on evidence we reviewed from hundreds of research studies in business, psychology, broadly in ethics, we present a top-down approach to helping workers develop moral character at work, focusing on what organizations can do to create a workplace in an environment conducive to ethical learning. This article is called Building an Ethical Company. In another article, we take a bottom-up approach focusing on what individuals can do, how they can take ownership over their own moral development at work and building an ethical career. Taken together, as I said, these two, both bottom-up and top-down approaches, really highlight the potential role of workplace as a moral laboratory where people can find opportunities and support they need to learn, grow, and develop their moral character. 3 core ideas I want to share and highlight here with you all. First one is importance of ethical learning and building character given our moral fallibility. All like data I showed you, the evidence really points out that for us to be successful, we have to change our mindset and approach when it comes to ethicality. We have to really take more of a learning orientation and focus on building character development, because we are morally fallible. Second is ethics and character development. These are lifelong pursuits. It's not one time. It's something that you have to take on in your life, and you get better over time. And third, my goal here is to emphasize that it's not only organization role to focus on helping workers make more ethical decisions in the moment. We tend to focus on single decisions in organizations, rather than organizations are also could create environments that help employees become more ethical people in long run. That's my hope. Of course, it's important to reduce unethical behavior at work, but organization can also go one step further, and their workplace can serve as a moral laboratory that allows individuals to engage in an ongoing process of ethical learning. So this metaphor of workplace as a moral laboratory not only implies a place where workers can try new things and experiment and learn from their failure, but leaders and managers should learn from these mistakes and successes and make course correction to the design of their organization's ethical environment. Once again, the focus is with this metaphor of ethical moral laboratory, the focus is on learning. It's a very different approach compared to current approach where organizations and leaders are basically more defensive and they are really trying to just avoid bad behavior. The reason I find organizations' role in character development so important is that first, we spend thousands of hours at work, correct? Like we spend most of our day at work. Second, we face a lot of complex decisions on the job, and we are influenced by the powerful organizational factors each day. So all this points out to the importance of workplace when we think about character development. So character development isn't reserved for our personal life only. Both in our personal and professional life, we have to really take a learning approach and focus on character development and ethical learning. And all these combinations will contribute to development of our moral character over time. So while there are many psychological and social factors that hinder a person's desire and ability to engage in ethical learning, in our paper, in our top-down approach, we focus on five of these psychological factors that are very important when it comes to ethicality: defensiveness, overconfidence, selfishness, inexperience, and negative social influence. I'm not going to go into the details. I think it's going to take hours to really go through each of these and provide the explanation why each of these are barriers to ethical learning and go over the recommendation. I just want to highlight a few. For example, here, one of the things that is quite important, and I want to remind you, is the issue of basically the overconfidence. So let me just give you an example on this individual barrier, the overconfidence. We know that people often overconfidently rate themselves as being better worker, leaders, athletes, even better drivers to compare to majority of others. So relevant to our discussion, a US News and World Report survey asked 1,000 Americans to rate whether they are and like they themselves and a various set of celebrities are likely to go to heaven. And what we see here is that, and these are the percentages, like obviously Mother Teresa, high percentage of people saying that she would go to heaven. But what about yourself? What we actually see here is that it's very interesting finding that 87% indicated they were destined to go to heaven, more likely than anyone else on the list we had, even like including Mother Teresa. Simply, people tend to view themselves on average as morally superior than others. So, and Why is this important? The reason is that when you think about overconfidence, it's a barrier, and we have to really focus on moral humility. With moral humility, it's a recognition of one's own moral fallibility and appreciation of the moral strengths and views of other people. So we know that, for example, receiving accurate feedback can help decrease a person's overconfidence. When it comes to morality, we have to think about feedback as well. And there hasn't been that much focus either in research or in practice about feedback when it comes to moral domain. I have some studies looking at 360 data within a company, as well as laboratory experiments that show that we may be giving less developmental feedback after moral lapse compared to competence lapses. Basically, given how pervasive everyday dishonesty is and the issue of, and given the moral fallibility, ironically, we are depriving those who we see as less moral after moral lapse. We are really not giving them vital developmental feedback that can help them improve. So we have a tendency to not give developmental feedback after moral lapse compared to competence lapse. And given the sensitive nature of morality, we show that people often are less likely to seek and receive feedback as well related to ethics at work, making moral overconfidence a particular challenge to overcome and thus a hindrance to ethical learning. Once again, we have to really be open, and moral humility is a very important attribute here. So this is one I wanted to highlight when it comes to individual barriers. As I said, there are a couple of others that I encourage you to think more about and read about. Perhaps the greatest barrier when it comes to ethical learning at work is the issue of negative social influence, because it can be very mechanism that reinforces other mechanisms and other barriers at the individual level. It can lead to the normalization of unethical behavior because people learn vicariously from those people around them, from peers, work groups, your leaders. They have all a large impact on what employees learn and how they behave. Socialization processes at work at times can be intentionally or unintentionally allowing for normalizing unethical behavior and leading to collective corruption. Norms related to performance pressure, competition, economic decision frames, and business frame of mind, all of them, again, some of these I have shown in my own research as well. I have examined them, and they all are powerful forces that could create a culture that leads to unethical behavior. So it's really putting a lot of emphasis on creating ethical culture. We have to oversee these issues and really correct for them and create ethical culture. It's my hope that these guiding principles and recommendations we have, they are really a starting point for you all when you are thinking about helping your employees become their best moral self. So I want to encourage all of you, organizational leaders, to view the ethical learning and character development of your workers, your employees, as a lifelong pursuit that can be fostered through adopting a perspective of moral laboratory in the workplace, really giving them opportunities to learn and grow, and a focus on more positive side on encouraging them to be more ethical rather than just avoiding bad, a focus on doing good as well. So let's transition to the bottom-up approach and a focus on the individual. So far, the focus was more systematic from the organization side, but ultimately, having an ethical career isn't just about making singular ethical decisions. It involves preparing in advance for ethical challenges, instituting proper safeguards for ourselves, and making good decisions in the moment, and then reflecting on each of these. So basically, in the framework, what I want to really talk about and put the responsibility on employees and really ask them to take ownership of their career as well. I think both a combination of this bottom-up and top-down approach is where we could end up in better organizations, more moral organizations that help members to learn and grow. So transitioning to this, let me just give you a few examples, the way I've been thinking about this issue when it comes to individuals building an ethical career. So in the planning stage, so the way I describe it, going back to the prior slide, you see that you're talking about 3 different stages. Basically planning ahead for any of these type of ethical challenges that we want to, that we may encounter, and instituting safeguards. The other is in the moment when you encounter moral choices, what you can do, and then reflection after the fact. I think that's quite important, very important when it comes to learning. So in the planning stage, you should really focus on managing yourself and knowing yourself and setting morally relevant goals for yourself and establishing personal safeguards to avoid temptations. Again, you have to be very prepared when it comes to these type of situations. And there are a couple of different guidelines we provide here when it comes to how you could set moral goals and have safeguards in place. Then in the when it comes to planning ahead, we basically talk about what you could do yourself, as well as how you could manage your relationships with others and the context. So we know that other people play a significant role in our morality. So managing our relationship and environment is quite important. For instance, finding ethics mentors and clarifying other people's expectation of you. All of these are necessary steps that we have to really think about them beforehand, before something happens. So this could be direct communication, or it could be indirectly as well. For example, in one of my studies, we show that participants were much less likely to ask an online partner to engage in unethical behavior, basically lying, after receiving an email from that partner with a virtuous quotation in the signature line, something like "success without honor is worse than fraud." So basically, with including that type of quotation, the person was able to use this as a safeguard, so they are less likely to be asked by their superior to do something questionable. The main point here is that showing your character, I think, is quite helpful. It really clarifies other expectation of you. It makes it clear to others, and what they ask you to do is going to be impacted, by that perception. So it's important to be very, clear about the expectations, and this could be direct, or it could be more indirectly, like the example I just gave you with a quotation in a signature line even. Now, in the moment, what do we have to do? When facing these type of decisions, we have to be morally aware. We have to explicitly look for moral implication of our decision. There is a lot of evidence that what we call moral fading, that when people are making decisions, the moral implication of their work isn't something that they pay attention to. So being aware is quite important. Another thing is avoiding rationalization. So the human mind is skilled in justifying morally questionable behavior when there is self-interest involved. We often tell ourselves things like, "Oh, everyone does this. I'm just following my orders. It's like I'm doing this for the greater good. It's their own fault. They deserve it." So we do a lot of questionable behavior, and we really are creative, and we could come up with justifications. But it's important to be aware of these tendencies. So, for example, we can think of 3 tests that can help us avoid these self-deceptive rationalization. The first one, the publicity test. Would you be comfortable having this choice and your reasoning behind it published on the front page of the local newspaper? This is a great test. The other is the generalizability test. Would you be comfortable having your decisions serve as a precedent for all people facing a similar situation? And lastly, the mirror test. Would you like the person you saw in the mirror after this decision? Is that the person you truly want to be? So I think, again, each of these tests is going to give us a chance to really think twice when we are making these decisions, and make sure we are very clear on moral implication of our decisions. And finally, not rushing the decision is super important. In a classic social psych study, one of my favorites, they show that students at Princeton Theological Seminary were much less likely to stop and help a stranger that was lying helplessly on the ground when they were facing time pressure to go and deliver a lecture. Basically, it's ironic, but they were less likely to help when they were under time pressure. In short, we have to be aware of time pressure and the timing of our decisions. So like we all heard about, sometimes when we are making decisions, we are told, sleep on it. It really is important when it comes to ethical decisions. It's a great advice to really think about these decisions more carefully. Earlier, I discussed the effects of time of day or like being tired on ethical decisions. Time pressure has been shown to be very hurtful as well. So giving ourselves enough time when it comes to ethical decisions to fully consider the implication of our decisions is very important. And when it comes to managing relationship and the context, we have to seek guidance from others, both inside and outside our organization, people who very much we trust them. We have to be aware of social pressure. So really understand the underlying motives and how like other people could impact your decision at any point in time. And really understanding the situation is going to help you, avoid these type of pressures. Understanding the organizational policies is quite important, consulting these policies. Organizations spend a lot of resources, time creating codes of conduct, websites, hotlines, and all that. Using these resources and asking yourself if there is any relevant policy, practice, anything available that you can use. So it's people within your organization, inside and outside, as I said, like mentors, but beyond that, the organizational policies, just relying on the resources available from your organization. When it comes to reflection, my focus here has been really on learning, and learning from experience is an iterative, long pursuit. A lot of growth happens when we try to learn from our decisions. We reflect when we make decisions, and then we reflect on them. And ethical people aren't perfect, but when they make mistake, they view and reflect, and then they can do better in the future. I think that's really important, and I want this to be your, one of the take-home messages, that we aren't perfect. It's rather being intentional and reviewing and reflecting on our own actions to learn from it for future. And it's important for us to really reflect on both successes and failures when it comes to ethicality. It's not just negativity and failures. We have to learn from both our success and failures. So adopting an ethical learning orientation, very specifically asking yourself, what can I do to be a better person? I think going through these type of reflection and exercises is quite powerful. When it comes to self-reflection, as I said, we focusing on learning from our experiences. Another, some research I've done actually focuses on how much people's tendency to basically separate their personal and professional life, and this type of distinction or separation between personal and professional self, what we call really identity segmentation, really leads people to engage in more questionable behavior, because people really use different code of conduct or moral code at work and at home. And for that reason, integration of these identities is quite important. My research has shown that when people have an integrated identity, when they think about their professional and personal life, that leads to a sense of authenticity and more ethical decisions. So again, I encourage you to really think about these, your personal and professional life, and integrate them and think about them, and try to become a better moral person, both in your personal and professional life. So thinking about reflection, as well as even having some, metrics when you think about your ethicality, it all helps you. And finally, when it comes to relationships and context, once again, I mentioned it earlier, it's all about learning. I think seeking moral feedback, asking people, after the fact, getting their input in terms of the type of decision you have made and what you can learn from them, and learning from the feedback received. I mentioned earlier that we have shown in my research, we have shown that people are less likely to give you feedback, developmental feedback, and you're less likely to ask this type of feedback. This is our tendency to avoid moral conversations, and because we avoid and we have this tendency, we have to be more mindful and intentional and specifically ask for ethical feedback. We have to really assess our fit, moral fit as well. Is this the type of organization, job that is a good fit for me? Is this the industry I want to be part of? So it's really important to really seek opportunities and think about like our fit when it comes to our organizations. And finally, I want to really briefly talk about job crafting as well. When it comes to our jobs, we have a lot of opportunities. It's important to really adopt the perspective and focus on crafting our jobs and thinking about how we can change our tasks, relationships, perceptions, everything to really make sure that our job brings out our best selves. I think it's important to be active and intentional when it comes to a job crafting as well. And I want to, reiterate the importance of these core ideas I shared, and mainly emphasize this idea of workplace as a moral laboratory. I think it's quite important if you think that way, if you really take the opportunity to think about work as moral laboratory, it provides you with opportunities for yourself, for leaders, and for workers to really think about how they can learn and grow in their jobs. And I hope that with this perspective, you all, are able to really learn and grow and become our better selves. Thank you, everyone. And I think I'm going to open it up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So much learning in that presentation, and I'm glad to see some of the ideas and prescriptions that you offer at the end. You generated so many questions in the Q&A, and some of them you answered along the way, but the question that got the most interest and votes, I think it relates, Maryam, to when toward the beginning of your talk, you talked about character development. You also talked about learning. This person's question that had a lot of interest was, have you done any research on how behavior changes with religious affiliation or with educational level? So does that help or hinder the moral behavior?
So I haven't done research on religion, and I'm currently doing some work, on habits that I would say and rituals, which I say is related. So I think I'm going to talk about that. But the reason is that I think when we think about religion, obviously, there is the idea of religion, and then it comes with a set of practices. So my focus so far has been on practices rather than just the activation of the idea of religion. If people are interested, there is a lot of research being done on activation of the concept of the God or religion in social psychology, moral psychology. And obviously, there is interesting work showing that, activation of obviously concept of being watched or God could impact people's behavior, leading to less, for example, cheating. Having said that, there is some research showing that religious people tend to engage in some questionable behavior that is more justifiable versus not. So again, my point is that I think it's just probably not right. At least my view is that not think too much about religion rather than the practices or the mindfulness and intentionality that comes with the religion. That's my hope. And I'm currently doing some research in which we are focusing on routines and practices and how routines and practices could help people moralize issues and engage in moral behavior. So, and I think there is some evidence. I think it's, basically the idea here is that to think about long-term effects, correct? And we have done some studies providing some evidence that some educational content is likely to help people to moralize an issue and actually change their behavior. I think it still is too early. I've done like a couple of studies, but I don't have as much data to feel super confident, honestly. But I think there is definitely some evidence showing that like our routines, habits, rituals are powerful, and they could help us moralize issues and then like engage in better behavior, basically.
So that seems like something that we can do in our education of students, is to help them think about what those practices or routines or, even artifacts that they have that, might signal to them, to have more awareness of moral behavior.
Definitely. I think I like, even in my classes and like with my MBA students, I do a lot of emphasis on self-reflection and, and ask them to write journals and all that. So I think when it comes to morality, or broadly, when it comes to us being very mindful of what we do in our like everyday interactions and behaviors, I think there's a lot of evidence and value in self-reflection, I'll argue. And I think there is evidence showing that.
So that leads to a kind of philosophical question that another person asked, and it's about, do these findings that you shared, I think especially in the earlier half of your presentation, do these findings imply that human behavior is inherently immoral and that we need this self-regulation or external regulation to control our behaviors?
So I think this is definitely a debate and I don't know, like, I don't want to really engage, like say something like normative as well, to be frank, but I think what I say is that, like, if you think like evolutionary in a sense, correct, about like morality, because we are social animals, social beings, we could see how morality has been developed to function our behaviors, to make our social life possible, correct? With that perspective, you see that, obviously there is a lot of, when it comes to our self-interest, being selfish, I mean, it comes, we have tendencies to be selfish because it's about resources, correct? But at the same time, like evolutionary, when we think about it, like, there is a lot about like us really wanting to be moral as well. So my point is that often there is this conflict between like your self-interest and like being ethical and being seen as ethical. And I think this is like the tension we always are facing. But what's important, I just want to add here, is that like there is a lot of evidence showing that even if, like, going back to what I said earlier, that people are likely to cheat a little bit, but not to a fullest. What the idea there is that it's just, we want to really be ethical and be seen as ethical. There is a lot of value in moral self-concept. So it's not just we are unethical whenever we are given an opportunity. It's not the econ perspective that it's all about opportunities and the sanctions. No, there is a lot of deep psychological processes at play here, that because we want to be ethical as well. So that's the reason we engage a lot of like justifications, because ultimately what we really care is about self-concept being moral. So I know that I didn't really answer like yes or no, whether I think it's like our tendency is to be ethical or not. I think it's very much contextual. I think it's going back to my argument, it's all about like the situation you are in, the context you are in. There are times or situations that like the tendency or the default would be moral, and times that's not. And I think what we want to do through these practices and being more mindful is to really to create a habit of being ethical in a sense. I think that's quite important. So let's not focus on whether at core we are ethical or not, rather than I think it's all about really making that our default.
Yeah, and I definitely heard that in your presentation, that this is a journey that we're on, and it's all about, learning and developing ourselves, but also when we're in roles as leaders or colleagues, how can we also help others develop and learn as well. And so many of the questions, I wish we had another 15 or 20 minutes to ask the rest of them, because they're very much from the heart about how can we be better? How can we do better? But unfortunately, we are out of time. So I am going to say a big thank you to Maryam. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I'd like to also thank the Center for Positive Organization staff and the Ross staff who help envision these sessions and support them and put them on. You'll receive an email from us later this week when the link for the video is ready so that you can share it or watch it again. Our next Positive Links series session is with Professor Andy Hoffman, one of my colleagues here at Ross. He's going to be talking about his book entitled Management as a Calling, and that will take place virtually on February 17th from 4 to 5. We really hope you can join us. And again, thank you, Maryam, for such a stimulating presentation, and have a great day, everybody. Thank you,
everyone.